Bonjour, Anin, Sego, Watcha. Hello. Midway Gijik Dishnakas, Maingando Dam Thessalon Dunjabas Gugov Dinda. My name is Allan Mountford, and I would like to welcome you to my humble home. And I would also like to say thank you to the organizers of the Nishnabek G7 conference. Had a pretty formidable task this year in that as speakers we're not able to get to a location where we can sit and talk to you, where we can look at your faces and look into your eyes and have the discussions that we want to have. And that's the way of our people, is to gather and to talk and have an intermingling of the spirits that are gathered. So this whole COVID-19 thing has thrown a monkey wrench into all sorts of things, including this conference. And I would like to say congratulations to the organizers and thank you for allowing me to be part of that. A couple of things that I want to talk about today. And I'm going to present the information in 3 videos. And the first video is going to be talking about how we can understand fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, or FASD, in the education system. Second video is going to discuss how we as support and caregivers of people with FASD can have a voice in the education and the schooling system, when we can have that voice and what that looks like, what we can say and where our input can be heard. Then the third thing I want to do is I want to talk about this whole COVID experience and how we as First Nations communities can deal with this and maybe employ some of our traditional ways of teaching. So we'll have 3 videos, lots of information. And in all of that information, there will be times where I will say to you that this is particularly important. So this is a take-home message. When I say it's a take-home message, it means that despite everything that you hear in these videos, these are the things that I want you to take away for sure and to remember. Our classrooms are full of kids with FASD, not just in the communities, but throughout the province. Svetlana Popova from Center for Addiction and Mental Health a couple of years ago completed a study, and her figures indicated a higher rate of FASD than had been previously reported. But even she said that the numbers that she came out with were conservative at that point. So she's saying that 3 to 5% of our population is affected by prenatal alcohol exposure. She and I met shortly after that paper came out, and I indicated to her that anecdotally, in my experience, going throughout the province and talking to school boards, that we were probably looking closer to 8 to 10% of the kids in our school system are affected. And I asked her directly, I said, Lana, do you think I'm crazy for thinking that? And she said, absolutely not. She said that she agrees that as more professionals become aware of FASD, as the diagnostic criteria become more widely known and used, that as a result of that, the prevalence of FASD will increase, whether there's more raw incidences of FASD or whether it's just because of an increase in knowledge about FASD, that she said that easily 8 to 10% of our kids are affected by prenatal alcohol exposure. And that has huge ramifications in our school systems. We know that our population sees alcohol as being something that's very accepted. If you take a look at any movie on Netflix now or on the television, there are multiple uses of alcohol throughout an hour and a half or 2-hour movie. Kids are watching this, and what we know is that Centre for Addiction and Mental Health in the Ontario Student Drug Use and Health Survey, which went from 1997 to 2005, and then they update it every 2 years since. What they're finding is that there's a huge grade discrepancy, but kids are starting to drink at a very young age. 10.5% of grade 7 students in the province are drinking, and this isn't just experimenting with alcohol. This is drinking on a fairly regular basis. And then grade 8 it goes up to 12%. Then grade 9, almost 32%, and by grade 10, half of the high school population, this is junior high and high school, so it's from grade 7 up. Half of the grade 10s are drinking, 61% of the grade 11s are drinking, and then by grade 12, 68.3% of the students in this province are drinking alcohol. So we know that alcohol is being used. And further to that, we know that when the youth are drinking, they are making poor decisions. 14% of the high school students in the province reported drinking hazardously. Could not remember what had happened to them after drinking in the past year, or were injured because of that. The study talks about youth drunkenness, and it talks about hazardous and harmful drinking. And hazardous drinking is where there's an established pattern of drinking that increases the likelihood of physical, social, or mental health problems, whereas harmful drinking refers to a pattern of drinking that is already causing this. And we know that 20% of high school students in Ontario drink hazardously or harmfully. So that represents about 139,000 high school students in Ontario. And there's no gender preference there between male and female. As I say, a pretty significant difference in terms of grade. Grade 7 drinking not as much, grade 12 drinking fairly heavily. And one of the disturbing facts that this survey uncovered was that almost 50% of the students indicated that a family member gave them the alcohol. So they're drinking, and they're drinking with the knowledge of their parents and of their family. And they're also engaging in unprotected sex. So we now have the equation here of alcohol use, unprotected sex, then presenting the challenges around prenatal alcohol exposure at a very young age with a lot of these kids. So the answer to that is education, and we'll talk about that as we go along here. But what happens then is that if alcohol is so prevalent through society, and if we know that a third of the women who are pregnant are binge drinking, we know that we have children in our school system with FASD, and they do things differently. They think differently. They behave differently from a lot of their peers, a lot of their school chums. So one of the challenges in education around people who think differently or do things differently is that we ask them to do things that are a challenge for them. And Einstein put it really well. He said, if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, then the fish is going to believe that it's stupid for his entire life. Well, in the school system, especially with kids with FASD, we ask fish to climb trees on a daily basis. We have all sorts of good reasons for this. We know that the curriculum says that all the animals have to be able to climb trees. The squirrels think that's awesome. The birds think it's awesome. But the fish and the elephants and the kangaroos all now say, oh boy, here we go. Here's another chance where we can look stupid in the classroom. Yet we continue to do that. So let's look at why we would ask a fish to climb a tree. Well, it could be for physical fitness. It could be because the fish need to figure out how to get away from predators. It may be that they need to learn how to find prey. The challenge is that none of that is relevant to the fish. Keep that in mind as we go through this talk, and we'll I'll elaborate on that one as we go through. So most of the kids that are sitting in the classrooms now will not have a diagnosis of FASD. And that's because the diagnostic situation in Canada is very problematic, and I'll deal with that in a second. But most of the kids who are diagnosed will be diagnosed under the old system. And about 4 years ago, the diagnostic criteria changed. Prior to that change, we had the designations of fetal alcohol syndrome, partial fetal alcohol syndrome, and alcohol-related neurodevelopmental disorder. And it was felt that the kids with partial fetal alcohol syndrome, at least at first a number of years ago, we said, well, that's really okay because they're only partially affected. And the kids with ARND, well, they're going to be okay because they don't have full FAS. Research and experience tells us that's not the case at all. As a matter of fact, the more normal that a child looks, the more normal we have expectations for them. And what we've found out over the years is that those with partial fetal alcohol syndrome and alcohol-related neurodevelopmental disorder often did worse than the kids with full fetal alcohol syndrome because we had more normal expectations for them. The new diagnostic criteria are a little more complex, but bottom line is, if the child does not have the facial features associated with fetal alcohol syndrome, and that's the medical triad, where the eyes appear to be further apart, but the reality is that the eye slits are smaller. The philtrum, this ridge between the nose and the upper lip, is either not there or is compromised, and there's a 4-digit scale for that. And then the third of the medical triad is a thin upper lip. So if a child has all three of those conditions occurring, there's a 95% predictor that there is prenatal alcohol exposure. So it's believed that if the child has the medical triad, then we do not have to know that there was prenatal alcohol exposure. If a child does not have those facial features, and it's what in the new diagnostic criteria is called the sentinel facial features, if they don't have those facial features, then chances of them getting an FASD diagnosis is very slim. So we also know that by the research done down in Oregon with facets with Diane Malbin, that if a child is in care, there's an 80% chance that that child has prenatal alcohol exposure. If the child is adopted, there's a 50% chance that that child has prenatal alcohol exposure. So what we know there is that kids who are in care or kids who are adopted, somewhere down the line, somebody in doing the paperwork had to determine whether mom drank when she was pregnant or not. Big stigma around that, still, unfortunately. So no mom wants to say, yeah, I damaged my kid. Nobody wants to say that. So quite often what happens in the paperwork is that that box does not get ticked off. So without definitive knowledge of prenatal alcohol exposure, if the child does not have the medical triad, those facial features, then they will not get an FASD diagnosis. And therefore, they will not be able to get a lot of the supports. But that tells us why so many of the kids in our classrooms who may have prenatal alcohol exposure or who exhibit learning challenges or behaviors consistent with FASD will not have a diagnosis. And part of the challenge there is